one of the things that has always, I suppose, in some ways troubled me about yoga, modern yoga teaching, because it's become so diverse. I think most of you who are in the yoga world will recognize that its diversity is profound these days. When does it stop becoming yoga? You know, and when can we still call it yoga? It's quite a hot topic at the moment. So it's one of the questions I'll be looking at. And also in the diversity of yoga, people are going off in very different strands. And you know, what I often get asked, you know, I get people emailing me with a YouTube clip saying, "What do you think of this, Pete? Is this all right?" And they're such a wide variety of things. I sometimes wonder what to say. You know, I don't like to be condemning of anything, but it's made me think about how we think about what is and what isn't yoga. That's one of the ideas, and I haven't got a definitive answer. Please don't think I'm going to give you a definitive answer. It's more of a discussion, an ongoing process. And I always like to, when I think about these things, I always like a big context. You know, 6 million years ago, we got onto two legs, roughly. Which, you know, if we're talking about movement, we've got to start to understand the context of movement. About 2.5 million years ago, we find skeletons with a lordosis, which means that they were really walking around all the time. They weren't tree climbers. So one of the definitive signs of whether people were habitually bipedal, not just sort of temporarily, is whether the foramen magnum on the skull is centrally located underneath the skull, not at the back, and whether there's a lordosis in the spine. These two things determine whether these were walkers or brachial climbers. About 1.6 million years ago, we seem to have found the first use of tools. I mean, these are very vague and they're moving all the time. Every time I read a paper on anthropology, something new's been discovered and everything gets pushed back another million years. 800,000 years ago, significant brain growth, which probably has implications for birth, because we know that you know, we're thinking about the development of consciousness, of when did we sort of, in a sense, move from being animals to being humans in the way we understand it. Part of that is to do with brain growth. 250,000 years ago, possibly first drawn symbols. 200,000 years ago, first modern humans in Africa. Yes, again, I think these are being pushed back. I think I had a look the other day, and it's another 500,000 years has been added recently. 120,000 years ago, making beads. 77,000 years ago, clothing. 50,000 years ago, drawings. 35,000 years ago, musical instruments. 11,000 years ago, actually this has been pushed back recently to about 9,000 years ago. There were several bipedal species on the planet until about 9,000 years ago. That's when the last of them disappeared. I find that quite astonishing. That's not very long ago, you know, in terms of human history, that we were on this planet sharing it with several other bipedal. I used to think it was just us and Neanderthals, but there are several other bipedal species that we were sharing the planet with. So we know agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago. We started drinking milk. 6,000 years ago, symbolic writing, and then you know, quite at the end of this, we start getting the birth of religions. People start, that to me, that means we started really thinking about origins. So we started to wonder where we came from, developing these ideas about where, you know, life, death, where we came from, where we're going to end. And then we have the yoga texts, and the Vedas about 3,000 years ago. I've often failed to remember what was going on in the West when this was going on in the East. So while they were writing the Vedas, which is ancient history, Marcus Aurelius was getting involved in the meditations, and we were looking at the planets. Patanjali, 1,500 years ago, at the same time. You see, Patanjali was trying to work out what it means to be human, what is consciousness, those kind of questions, using the cultural perspectives that he had In the West, we were trying to work out what it meant to be a Christian. We were doing a similar kind of thing. You know, what was the Trinity all about? Could God be the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost? These kind of questions were appearing all over the planet. So I find these kind of contextualizations quite useful. It demystifies it for me. It makes me think, okay, in that culture they were dealing with these kind of subjects. We were dealing with similar subjects in our own way over here. And then we have an interesting thing. There's not a lot of linking between 500 years ago, the Pradipika, and modern yoga. There are 2 or 3 quite good scholarly works around now by people like Mark Singleton, James Mallison, who have done a lot of research on the roots of modern yoga, the stuff that most of us practice. And it's quite hard to trace this stuff back much further than about 100 years, and that's generous. Really, the serious stuff that we all know and recognize is probably more like 60 years old. So that's another, I think, an interesting insight into, well, for me, what it does is free me up to be more critical. I don't feel like I'm messing with 2,000 years of history. If I start messing with it, I feel like I'm messing with something fairly recent, because I do mess with it a bit. Krishnamacharya was the probably father of, I mean, many of you probably know all this, but Krishnamacharya was an Indian guru, died about 5 years ago, aged 100. And he was the father of Desikachar, the uncle of Iyengar, and the teacher of Pattabhi Joy. So he was very influential in those 3 lineages that probably most of the people who work and teach at this place come from. They were, you know, they exported yoga to the West. Iyengar particularly, I remember when he first came over, because that was the kind of one I was embedded in. It was quite an interesting process watching him change and evolve, because certainly when I first saw him, he looked very Western. You know, he wore shorts and a t-shirt, and he had short hair, and taught in a very straightforward, practical way. That morphed a bit over time. We might come on to how that morphed. And then Vanda Scaravelli, who's someone I think we should acknowledge here, because she was an Italian teacher who did something I think very bold. You might not think she did something very bold, you might disagree, but I think she did something very bold, which was because she was a student of Desikachar, she was a student of Iyengar, she was also a close friend of Krishnamurti. And what she did, wittingly or unwittingly, was deculturalize yoga. She took it out of a Hindu context and made it very Western. But I don't think she devalued it wasn't a kind of a dismissing of Eastern culture, it's just that she wasn't a Hindu. So she went back to the notion of, what are we experiencing when we practice? That was her basic tenet. And in Europe, her influence has been, I think, subtly spreading through the yoga world, I think in a very positive way, because her encouragement to not follow other people's ideas, but to follow your own experience, I think is a significant thing. What do you feel when you practice on the mat? What do you notice about yourself? This next bit, I think, is politically quite hot, because you find yoga people divide into 2 camps. They either think it's a bit more like a religion, and the people who are more in the Vedanta camp, I think, tend to go in that direction, or you think it's a philosophy. If it's a philosophy, like all philosophies, it evolves, it changes, it demands some critiquing. Philosophies are there to discuss, to develop ideas, to move them forward. That's the point of philosophy. If it's a religion, it's a belief system, and it is less amenable to critique. So again, it depends on which side of the fence you're sitting in when you're thinking about these things. I have my most heated debates with people who think it's a religion, because I think it's a philosophy. And people up there in the ivory towers will debate this, and people down on the ground floor will debate this. But I think it's important that we know where we sit in that map. Are we thinking of yoga philosophically, or are we thinking of it as a religion? And of course, I think a great deal of us just hover around, not quite making up our mind, dipping into one and then dipping into the other. I'm not happy with that. I think we should really examine it a bit more and say, well, hang on, what are we doing here? So, yeah, I'm coming clean there, put my hand up. I think it's philosophy. I want to inquire into it. And I think the thing that I've always felt about yoga that has always attracted me to it is the notion that it involves inquiry into the body. It's a physical practice. Inevitably, it's about the mind. You know, we have this introspective aspect. It's about how do we feel, how do we sense ourselves, how does our mind work. And it's also a philosophical inquiry. What do I think about how we fit into a bigger world? For me, if you're doing that, you're doing yoga. If you're just stretching your hamstrings, you're probably doing exercise, and that's a different thing. I think these are, you know, I would delineate it like that. I don't think yoga is just a purely physical practice. I think it's a way of approaching the world through the body. So if you think about what's happened since, there've been some quite big changes, and it'd be silly not to acknowledge them. Evolution, cosmology, neurology, what happens when we die, all these kind of questions, they're big questions that yoga's dealt with or deals with. They're questions I think we should still be dealing with, but I think we should add to what we can see in the yoga texts anything extra that we've added since then. It just makes sense, you know, if we understand evolution, and we'll come on to this when we start thinking about biomechanics. You know, what do we know now about movement that they didn't know then that helps us understand how we can teach more effectively? And what are we trying to change when we're trying to teach people? I think these are significant issues. Having said all that, I'm very aware that I can fall into these traps just like everybody else. You know, we tend to look for stuff that supports our own point of view. We tend to dismiss stuff that we disagree with. So you might be sitting there going, no, I don't like all this. I think of it like this. I try very hard all the time when I'm thinking about these ideas to reflect on why I believe what I believe. And why do I think this? Why do I think that? And check in that I'm not falling into confirmation bias. I can't help but see the world through a cultural lens, the one I grew up in. I have some kind of biases there, I know that. Personally, I don't think I've got any hope of understanding the world through a Hindu lens, because I'm not. I live in the West and I don't live in India. I know a lot of people try. So my attempt and my interest has been, how do we take yoga into the West and move it forwards in the West without having to pretend we're Hindus? And that's not a disrespectful statement. I don't mean it in any way. But I'm not in that culture. I'm in a Western culture, born in this period in time. How am I going to move it forwards usefully, that I get the benefits from yoga that I think it profoundly has, because anyone who practices yoga seriously will be changed by it. And why are we changed by it? I think that's a very interesting question. And I think that's not just about culture. I think that's about the practice itself. So just to remind us that the modern yoga practices aren't that old. They stem, there's obviously Satyananda, Shivananda, these kind of guys who teach yoga as well, who aren't directly from this lineage. They probably are more culturally Indian than these three. And then, as I say, I want to talk about her not because I'm any devotee of hers at all, but I think we needed a lot of help to take yoga out of its context into a Western context. We need permission in a way. And I think one of the things Vanda did was give us permission to say it's okay to practice yoga without using lots of Sanskrit terms, without having to remember all long Sanskrit names, because they're only names, aren't they? I mean, what does Trikonasana mean? It's a shape. It has no meaning really. You can translate it if you like and call it a triangle. Well, does that help me understand anything about what we're doing in the pose? I doubt it somehow. And if you go to 5 different disciplines, of yoga practice, and you say Trikonasana, there'll be 5 different versions of it. So the word itself is fairly meaningless. unless we're all doing exactly the same thing. And we're not. It's clear we're not doing the same thing. So what are the common threads? So now this is where I think it all gets interesting for the teachers of yoga, for the practitioners of yoga. If you know, my journey, I don't know how many of you know my story. I started off in Iyengar yoga, and I've ended up in a kind of no man's land of what I call humanistic like yoga, an area where I have tried very hard to center yoga as part of a human experience, not as another person's experience. Iyengar yoga and a lot of yoga that came out of that lineage were very positionally based. Alignment is a very important theme in those schools of yoga. And then there's a very interesting question, which is, what are you aligning to? What is your alignment all about? You know, if we want to align our bodies to a shape, Trikonasana or Parshvakonasana or any other asana, what is significant about that shape, and why is it significant? Is there a rationale behind it? Is that been worked out? Personally, I don't think it has, and that's what I would like to challenge. You know, it's one of the things I challenge all the time in yoga. That there is no such thing as good or bad alignment. There's only, is what you're doing useful? Is it helpful? How do we decide what's helpful? And I think this is we get to the nub of it. What do human beings need to do that we can teach to improve the way people engage with their bodies? And for me, one of the people I went to a lecture in, I think it was about 1988, when I was studying osteopathy, by a man called Serge Grakovetsky. And I was a lecture on the knee. I went to a lecture on the knee. And I thought, it should be interesting. I'm an osteopath, I need to know about knees. And he started off talking about fish. And I thought, what's he on about? And he said, look, all movement started with the spine. It started from the spine as fish moving through the ocean. That's what the spine evolved for, locomotion. And it didn't stop when we came out of the sea and landed on land. The lizards borrowed it, snakes borrowed it. Our spines were evolved to locomote us, first of all in water, then on land, and legs grew out to exaggerate the movement. And then when the lower lizards turned into mammals, the legs moved underneath. There was an evolutionary process about the same time as legs moved from the side to underneath. The lower ribs disappeared, because all lizards have ribs through their lumbar spine. The lumbar ribs disappeared. They formed a diaphragm and a soft belly. And land mammals can move with flexion and extension. So flexion and extension became the second evolutionary movement. If you look at a greyhound running or a cheetah running, it's a process of this. The spine is the driver of movement. The legs extend the movement. And what we've done, and Grakovetsky rather scathingly calls leg theorists, people who think it's the legs that walk us. He said that only appears to be that because now, we've, after a few million years of evolution, our legs look like they do all the work. But he said the spine evolved to drive us through space. And his book, The Spinal Engine, hinges on the fact that even without legs, we can walk quite competently with the movements of the spine. And in bipeds, the movement is rotation. And he's got this wonderful clip, unfortunately I can't load it on here, but of a man born with no legs walking across a room like this, and you zoom in on him, so you can't see he's got no legs. He's got his t-shirt off, he's wearing a pair of shorts, and he's walking along a room like this, and you would just think he was a normal human being. You wouldn't have any idea that he didn't have any legs, because the movement of the spine is just so well known. Interestingly, it's very similar to the movements of elite athletes. There's a lot of movement going on. He's using the rib cage and the spine very efficiently to locomote his pelvis, because of course the only way you can move if you've got no legs is to move one sitting bone forwards and then the next. It's a rotation pattern. When you understand historically that this spine has evolved for side bending, flexion, extension and rotation, you can start to ask reasonable questions about what is useful to teach. It can accommodate those movements. So the spine is evolved to repeat some movements very regularly, very safely. You can safely ask a spine to rotate over and over again. It's not going to strain it. It's had millions of years of evolution to support that movement. Similarly with flexion, extension, and with side bending. These are safe movements. And then you get some movements in yoga, and this is going to be controversial, like this, which are nothing like that, you know. These aren't those kind of movements. And you've got to say, well, what are we doing then? Why are we teaching that? This is a kind of modern construct that doesn't really... And if you put a movement into a spine that it hasn't architecturally got any support for, you're probably going to hurt it if you keep asking people to do it over and over again. And people do hurt themselves doing yoga. You know, in the last 10 years, there's been a plethora of books on how yoga wrecks your body, you know. How yoga ruined my life. I don't know, it's out there as a kind of phenomena. And you go, well, why is this happening? Well, it's because we're doing things our body didn't evolve for. You know, if you were teaching yoga to a horse, you wouldn't teach it the splits. It would be stupid because architecturally that anatomy isn't evolved for it. You know, horses do this, they don't do this. So if you start putting a movement into a horse, its ligaments, its bones, its structure are going to be strained by movements like that. If you ask people to do movements we're not well adapted for, you risk hurting them. So you have to make a judgment about what are we adapted for and what aren't we adapted for. And that's a really important consideration if we love our students and we don't want to hurt them. And I don't want to hurt them. Oh yeah, the other thing, and this is nicely controversial in the yoga world, some of you will have bumped into this debate. You know, if you're a biped, the thing you have to do, perhaps more often than anything else, is to bend down and pick things up. You know, it's a fairly common thing if you're on two legs. Quadrupeds don't have to worry about that. How do we bend? You know, and I sometimes feel very exasperated the number of people who still think the right way to bend is to hinge at the hips and bend like this. I bet you no hunter-gatherer ever bent down and picked anything up like that. I bet they didn't. I bet they just bent down like that because that's functionally what we're adapted for, to round our backs up and bend our spines. So you can, and there's a, you know, I could unpack that argument in more detail if you want, but these things are analyzable. These are easy to check out if you just look at a bit of functional anatomy. And you can start to then winnow out between modern yoga practice, what are useful practices and what are less useful practices? What are we teaching that's helpful? What are we teaching that is unhelpful? And I think if we're going to take yoga forwards, we need to be doing this. This is an ongoing process of how do we improve teaching in the future. I think it's an important project. So this brings us on to another, I think, interesting topic. And it's kind of current as well. You see, I mean, I look in the program there and I'm noticing a lot more kind of Feldenkrais, somatic work, all these kind of things coming into the yoga world. How do we learn to move? If you think about it, any animal, any baby doesn't learn to move through studying anatomy. You know, it's just not how we learn. We learn to move through trial and error, experimentation. You know, we're born without a motor map. So we have a few actually, it's not quite true. So when we're born, we have a few maps of movement. We can suck, we can swallow, we can cough, we can grasp, we can root, and actually we can side bend, strangely. It's one of the very first locomotor movements that we've got. So we come into the world with a few maps that help us survive. Maps of movement are the way our sensory motor cortex organizes movement into behavioral patterns. We learn them through the practice of the movements we need to do in our culture, which is usually, you know, walking, running, sitting, scratching our head, feeding, all those kind of things. And by the time we've got to about 3 or 4, we've got most of the maps fairly well written into our brain. If you're not quite sure what I mean here, I think the biggest contrast, the most easy way of assessing good maps from bad maps is fingers, hands and feet. You know, I can do all these kinds of things with my hands. With my feet, even though I practice quite a lot, I can just about move toes individually, you know, just about. I certainly couldn't write my name very easily with them. If you see people who are born without arms, they are as dexterous with their feet as I am with my hands. So you write maps through practice. And the way we write the map isn't by instruction, it's by repetition. Now, in terms of teaching, in terms of thinking about this is neurologically often divided into two camps, what they call computational movements and embodied movements. And the people who have investigated this the most, probably in current times, are roboticists. People who are trying to get robots to move well have done a lot of work on how do we get robots to move like human beings, as well as human beings. And the first attempts were very computational, so they would make a computer with a huge processor, enormous processor, which would run programs. They'd be kind of walking programs or skipping programs or kicking a ball programs, and they would show these robots off doing a variety of tasks that looked very impressive, actually. They got robots walking up stairs and walking downstairs. But what you noticed was that the room was always completely flat. There was nothing unpredictable could ever happen. And if anything went wrong, the robot just turned into a can of beans. There was no kind of protective reflex. Until about 15 years ago, and a company in America called Boston Dynamics started to really look at how animals evolved movement. And they realized it was through what we sometimes call bottom-up processing, sensory feedback to a central processor. So coming from the body to the brain, not from the brain to the body. If you're running from the brain to the body and you're running programs, it's very difficult to be adaptive to changing circumstances. So if something changes in the environment and you've just got a program running in a particular way, then that change in the environment is going to mess your program up and you won't be able to adapt for it. If you're bottom-up processing, in other words, if you're relying on sensations from your body and informing your brain where you are in space, and that the floor suddenly gives away in front of you, you can register that and say, well, I've just noticed my leg's gone down there. What do I do about it? Well, put the other leg out. And you can correct yourself. And this company called Boston Dynamics has now developed robots that can walk very competently on snow, through the woods, in very unpredictable terrain. And what they're doing is putting a massive amount of sensors into the body and a really small brain. The brain just runs a program, I'm going forwards, I'm going backwards, I'm stopping, I'm sitting down, or whatever the task that they need to do is. So they don't need a big processor, they just need a lot of information to tell that robot where it is in space. And the last robot I saw by Boston Dynamics is a biped doing a backflip and landing on its feet, which is a very impressive job for a robot. Now, if we understand that, if we have I just want to step back a little bit and argue that mostly, certainly when I was studying osteopathy and when I first studied Iyengar yoga, I think it was a very different way of thinking, in that movement was often reverse engineered by studying anatomy. So you would look at, I guess it imagines, starting from the dissections of bodies, you see where a muscle has its origin and insertion, and you can determine from that in a kind of mechanistic way, well, if this muscle shortens, it's going to flex the knee, or it's going to straighten the elbow, or it's going to side bend my spine. And most anatomy books, until very, very recently, have been written like that. You give them the name of a muscle, you give them its origin, its insertion, its innervation, and then its function. It's an elbow flexor, it's a hip flexor, it's a knee extender. That view of the body lends us to thinking that the structure of us, our posture, or the way we stand, is organized by individual muscles. So if you see someone sort of standing like this, you analyze them from that perspective, and you go, oh, the pectoral muscle is clearly too tight, the rhomboids and the traps are a bit too loose, so we'll strengthen the rhomboids and the traps at the back and we'll stretch the pecs, and that will straighten the person out. And that's how I was taught osteopathy. Basically, you're looking for the tight muscles and you stretch them. You're looking for the weak muscles, you strengthen them, and that was the process of how you analyze people's posture. That turns out to be completely wrong. And the way, and it leads you to thinking that you can solve problems by, I don't know, doing exactly that. Stretch your quadriceps, stretch your hamstring, strengthen your core, and that solves a perceived problem of, I don't know, back pain or knee pain or whatever. By looking at the body in a mechanistic way and trying to correct the mechanics. Now, where that's fallen foul, are you kind of with that as an idea? You know, you understand that kind of concept that we have this mechanistic view of the body. I think it's very common in the exercise world, in the manual therapy world, that we view bodies like that. It's partly, I think it's partly driven into our culture by Newtonian physics developing alongside things like Leonardo da Vinci, Vesalius, the people who do anatomical dissections, drawings. At the same time, the Victorians and pre-Victorians were building these machines along mechanistic lines. It's very, very seductive view of the body. And alongside that were neurological studies from people like Charles Sherrington onwards, where they were studying how does the brain get people moving. And one of the ways they did it, one of the leading proponents of this study was a man called Wilder Penfield, who was a neurologist, and he would often have to work on, do work on people's brains. You'd take a part of the skull off, have to take out the tumor or whatever it is you were working on. But he was also incredibly interested in which part of the brain mapped which part of the body. So while he was taking the bit of the skull off, he would put in a little electrode on a part of the brain and see which muscle twitched, and he'd note it. And he did this for about 30 years, until he had mapped, as accurately as he could, which part of the brain controlled which muscle. And if you've studied any neurology, you'll have probably seen a picture of what they call the sensory motor homunculus. So it's a picture of a kind of brain with a rather strange looking man sort of spread over it with great big lips and great big hands, and because we have more nerves supplying our hands and our mouth than we do our back and our legs, so the homunculus looks like an oddly distorted person. But his goal was to identify exactly which neuron or which group of neurons controlled which muscles. And he tried to do it by refining and refining and refining the size of the electrodes, minimizing the current that he'd put in. So he didn't want any overlap. He didn't want this current sort of spilling into other neurons to get a false reading. So it was always a case of finding it down, until he got this one-to-one relationship. And then he drew this map, and that was in 1941, I think. And that hasn't changed until 2005. In 2005, Michael Graziano, an American researcher, was doing similar work with slightly more sophisticated equipment. And I don't know whether it's just a bit more careless, but he left the electrodes on, not for the 0.5 of a millisecond that he should have to get a little twitch response in a muscle. He left it on for half a second. And he was on the bicep. So he should have been getting a little twitch in the bicep. But he left the electrode on far too long. And he was astonished to see that this person's mouth opened. And he thought, well, that's mad, because I'm nowhere near the mouth. That can't be true. I also noticed that the fingers started working. There's another part of the brain miles away. And he was so kind of surprised by this. He got all his colleagues in around and said, look, what happens if I put it? I'm on the bicep. Look, all these other things are going. What's going on? And it triggered a whole new line of inquiry. And he discovered that what happens when you stimulate a motor neuron isn't that the impulse then descends towards a muscle. That's not what happens. The first thing it does is talk to other neurons and go, what are we doing? What's the movement? And what he realized is the brain is set up in movement patterns. He called them behavioural repertoires. So when they saw the bicep twitch, that's actually a feeding movement. So that whole repertoire of movement becomes apparent when you stimulate that neuron. Or it could be a scratching movement or a walking movement, depending on where you are. There is, and this is what he was so explicit about, there is no one-to-one relationship between a neuron and a muscle, none, ever. Now if we know that, if we start to realise that the way we learn to move is in movement repertoires, functional movement patterns as Feldenkrais called them, then we need to think about that in our yoga, I think. That we should stop thinking about, am I stretching a hamstring, am I working on a core, am I don't know, whatever it is, fragmented ways of looking at the body. In other words, am I working on a hip or a shoulder? And we should be thinking, is this a turning movement? Because we know turning is something human beings do. Is this a bending movement? Or is it a side bending movement? You know, the movements that we know we are well organized to, are well set up for. And if we clarify our intentions along those lines, we're more likely to help people out of any problem than looking at a bit of them and dealing with that bit, because the body just doesn't think in bits. Philosophically, they call it the neurological fallacy, that the part of something represents the whole, and it doesn't. You can't look at a bicep, a bicep, you can't even say the bicep bends the arm. It's a silly way of thinking about it, because a bicep has no capacity to bend an arm unless it's attached to a human being. So you have to talk about a human being bends the arm, and the bicep is involved. But it's not just the biceps involved, the tricep has to relax. So there's loads of other muscles involved, the brachialis, we could go through them all. I'll also, every time I do something like that, I'll shift my body weight. There'll be lots of things going on in my body. All movements are whole body movements. I mean, we could talk about just lifting a finger like that, maybe not. But generally in life, when you think about a movement, it's a whole body movement. And if we're teaching, I think we need to think more about how we think about movements in a global term rather than in a local term. In fact, the only time we ever really think about ourselves in bits is if we hurt ourselves. We bang our knee and go, oh, my knee hurts. And I think about a bit of me. But when I'm walking around, I'm never thinking, oh, my latissimus dorsi is working very nicely. My serratus anterior is nicely engaged here. It's just not how it is. I'm either feeling good when I'm walking or I'm not. And it's a Pete Blackaby experience. It's not a serratus anterior experience. So when people run into problems with their bodies, you can ask the question, why? I sometimes think it's a funny thing when I increasingly realize it's a funny thing. Particularly, it doesn't matter if I'm an osteopath or a yoga teacher, and they say, I think my psoas is in spasm. And it's like it's rebelling against you. Psoas has just had an idea, I think I'm going to go into spasm, as if it's disconnected and just having a go. Now, the psoas isn't independent. I mean, you're doing it. But the psoas is something that you're unconsciously tightening. You're just not aware that you're doing it. So what we should be trying to do is help people notice why they keep tightening their psoas. And then stop blaming the psoas. It's not its fault, it's sort of shooting the messenger. The psoas no muscle just rebels. It can't do. It does what it does because unconsciously we've learned to tighten it. Usually, three main reasons why we unconsciously tighten muscles. I think three. You might be able to add one, but I think we do it through a kind of repeated cultural or environmental idea. I mean, I think the most pernicious one we get in the West is stand up straight, sit up straight. It's sort of stiffening and trying to make ourselves upright. I think that's a terrible thing to do. We might be modifying our behavior if we've hurt ourselves, if we've had a long-term injury and we start limping. And then that limp becomes part of us. So we might be tightening muscles because we've been doing something a long time. But I think the other one, and I suspect this is more common, is just childhood anxieties. That, if you think about prelingual kids, if they're anxious, and prelingual kids are probably the most anxious people on the planet because they've got no way of soothing themselves. They're completely dependent on parents and carers. So if there's any anxiety going on in a child, what can it do? It can't talk about it, it'll embody it. It'll immediately send out a way of expressing it through its muscles, because that's all it can do. And you see that, anyone who's had children or has worked with children will know that generally when a child is comfortable, it'll fold. If you pick up a child and it's happy with you, it'll be in flexion, it will fold forwards. It'll do that kind of movement. If you've got a girlfriend or a boyfriend and you're in love, it will be that. If it's that, you've got problems. It's any extension patterns with children. They're angry, they're cross, they're upset, they're in pain, and people do that too. So we get these patterns that are driven in when we're very young. If you've had it doesn't even have to be a particularly sort of traumatic childhood. We all suffer long-term. In my age group, if you went to primary school, it was pretty traumatic, and you have to face it every day. I can remember hating going to primary school and just sort of trying to survive for a couple of years. And you do that, how do you do it? You do it by holding on to yourself, and that becomes part of you. And you grow up, and you don't invent new patterns of distress just because you've grown up. You still will play the same ones out, and they become unconscious ways we are. And people's postures are very much a reflection of the lives they've lived. So if someone's tightening their psoas, it's not a big surprise. It's a defensive muscle. It's a muscle we use to protect ourselves. It's not the psoas's fault. It's the life you've lived. It's not their fault either. The life we live is we do our best. But sometimes, if we're going through a stressful time, those patterns of anxiety will reinvest themselves in your body, and you'll start hurting. And you think, well, why is that happening? I haven't done anything. And you always look to the physical things. I didn't lift anything, I didn't fall off anything, but my back's gone into spasm. But you are going through a difficult time at work, or there's a divorce on the horizon, or something like that. These are quite... In fact, pain is more correlated to anxiety and distress than it is to physical symptoms. More people with back pain don't have anything physically wrong with them in the kind of, there's actually tissue damage. They have anxiety and worries because that's the way we're wired up. So looking to the body for the solution is often the wrong place. What we should be trying to help people do is, in the most sensitive ways we can, notice the tensions that they bring. You start them off, you relax them, you put them in a position where they can relax, and then you start to get them to do something, and you can ask, well, is that really all you're doing? Or when you pushed your foot into the ground, or when you went into dog pose, did you tighten your neck? Did you lock your knees? Did you grip your toes? Did you do all those things that happen unconsciously when we're not really noticing? That's a very useful thing to help people discover, and it can take a long time to get people to notice the unconscious things they bring to movement. So we're trying to help people notice how they interfere with normal function. I think this is the way yoga should be going, not trying to stretch a hamstring. Yeah, perhaps putting it another way, we never tighten muscles because we're happy. That's not what we do. If you're with your mates, if it's a good environment, you relax. You sit in an armchair when you get home from work and it's nice, you've got back, you're inside and it's warm, you don't go like that. If you stiffen, it's nearly always a response to anxiety or stress. So when you see people with stiffnesses in their body, particularly in their trunk and in predictable places, their neck, their lower back, their hip flexors, I have a lot of compassion for those people because I think there's probably a difficult story in there somewhere, and my heart goes out to them. Yeah, and this leads to another question about pain and healing in yoga. Most tissues heal in about 6 to 11 weeks. You can break an arm, 6 weeks' time it's better. you sever a tendon, that might be 12 to 16 weeks. If you tear a muscle, it'll be better in about 4 or 5 days. It's got a fantastically rich blood supply. So if you've got a good blood supply, you heal very quickly. The tissues that have less good blood supply can take a long time, but we do heal. And generally what happens when we hurt ourselves is that we get pain commensurate with the amount of damage we've done, but over a period of weeks we notice the pain ebbs away until our body's healed and we're no longer in pain. So when people have pain in their back for 4 years, you've got to ask the question, what on earth's going on? Has that person healed or haven't they healed? Why wouldn't they heal? Now, all the evidence these days is that they do heal. But somehow, their nervous system, their central nervous system, is confabulating pain along the lines of what it expects or worries or predicts. So we now know that the central nervous system is much more important in pain sensitization than the tissues themselves. If you x-ray people who are over the age of 30, you'll find that inside a body, we age just as much as we do on the outside. And you'll find that most people, I think 75% of the asymptomatic population over the age of 50 have disc prolapses. Which means, you know, a few of you here might have disc prolapses. And you'll have experienced a back pain, may have gone on for a month or two, and then it healed. Or actually the right word is adapted. So we get adaptation to injury. We still have the prolapse, we're aware of that, we still have the prolapse, but it no longer causes pain. It's like if you cut yourself, you're left with a scar, but the pain goes away. Strangely, it's the same with arthritis. Not rheumatoid arthritis, I'm talking about osteoarthritis. Most people over the age of 35 have arthritic change in some of their joints, in their spines, in their knees, in their hips. And most people don't have pain. One of the most illuminating studies around injury was done in 1999 on meniscal tears of the knee. So they found 100 people with diagnosed meniscal tears on an MRI scan. So they knew all these people, they all had pain, they all had meniscal tears, they all sent them to hospital. They gave half of them an operation and they pretended to operate on the other half. They just put them under the knife and put them under the anaesthetic, made little incisions in there, put a bandage around, sent them off. Said, yeah, you've had the operation. And the interesting thing was they all got better exactly the same. There was no difference between the people who had the operation and those who didn't have the operation. So what changed? You know, why was that? And it's in perception. If you have a pain in your knee and you bend and it hurts, it's very common to think, I better stop doing that because I think I'm making it worse. Which is quite a reasonable thing to think. So you stop doing it and you keep having a knee pain. If on the other hand you've had an operation and then a physio says to you, look, it's going to hurt a bit, but your rehab is to bend the knee, ignore the pain, you have a positive expectation of the outcome. If you think it's making it worse, you have a negative expectation of the outcome. They call it placebo and nocebo. And we now know that these things are deeply powerful, really powerful. And if you go to a GP, you've got pain in your neck and they give you an x-ray, I've read the x-ray reports like this, you know, degenerative wear and tear, discs thinning, spondylitis, you know, degenerative disc disease is something they write. And you get that as a lay person, you think you're buggered, don't you? It's all over. And you're going to start being very careful with the way you move because you've got this degenerative neck. Well, actually, usually those kind of things, they should say, you've got wear and tear commensurate with a person of your age. That would be a much healthier thing to say. All people of your age have a bit of wear and tear because you've had a life. And if you've had a life, your bones are going to have to respond, your discs are going to have to respond, your knees are going to have to respond, and they'll show that they've responded, and you see it on an x-ray. So it's how we set ourselves up for things. And I'm much more mindful now, much more careful when people come to me, how I frame any problem that they seem to have. And I try and reframe it in as positive way as possible. Bodies heal, they always heal. That's the first thing I say. And to lead them towards a more hopeful outcome. So clarifying intention, so that means if I'm teaching yoga, what I think I should be doing is really be clear what I want somebody to do and hope it lands in their nervous system in a way they understand. Is this a turning movement? Is it a bending movement? Is it a sitting movement? And I try never to teach yoga in what I call a parts way. I don't teach any, this is for the hips, or this is for the shoulders, or this is for your tummy muscles. I never do that anymore. I haven't done that for years. Because the body doesn't think like that, the brain doesn't think like that. It's not how we are as human beings. So clarify what is it you're trying to do, because that always helps. So it needs to be useful, something, if you're going to give them something to do, give them something that human beings do a lot of. Don't give them something stupid like trying to get your leg behind your head, because how helpful is that really? And this other one, releasing muscles that are not required for movement. I spend a lot of time in classes trying to get people to differentiate three things. Relaxation. Do they know when their body's relaxed? Effort. The amount of effort we need to do whatever it is we're doing. It sometimes can be quite a lot of effort, sometimes it's not much effort. And then tension. What do we bring to a movement that's more than we need? Can we discriminate those things? I think they're very useful things to help people discriminate. Difference between those things. Because I want to take yoga off the mat. I want people to be able to do that when they're walking around, when they're walking the dog, when they're doing the housework, when they're working at their work. I want these things to be something you can reflect on all the time. And it's an introspective process. This last one is perhaps the one where links me to yoga again, because up until now, I could be teaching somatics or Feldenkrais or whatever. But I've been very influenced by a neurobiologist called Antonio Damasio, who wrote a trilogy of books. The first one was called Descartes' Error, the second one was called The Feeling of What Happens, and the third one was called Looking for Spinoza. He's a very interesting, I like multidisciplinary people. They always excite me more. So he's a psychologist, a neurobiologist, and a philosopher. And his research, all his research, is around the role of feelings in the body. Why do we have them? What is the point of feelings? And he divides emotions into two states. He talks about the feeling state, what it happens in our body, what actually happens to us, the tightening of a muscle, the holding of our breath, whatever else we see, the opening of our eyes. And then the emotion, the kind of psychological state that brings on. And he argues that it's quite difficult to have the emotion, the psychological state, without a body state underpinning it. So one of his arguments is that, if we have a habitual state of body, we're likely to have a habitual state of emotion. We might be always slightly fearful, we might be always slightly angry, we might be always slightly, sad, something like that, because our body states reflect those. And again, that will be from childhood. We tend to carry these things through. The tantruming child, or the child that always bursts into tears, or the one that's so timid it never gets on the slide. Those things don't tend to just vanish through life. I think we carry a lot of those ideas, and a lot of our adulthood is learning to get over those childhood stuff. Well, he says that so some part of it's pretty obvious, isn't it? We have signaling systems in our nervous system that if I'm sitting on the floor for 5 minutes and my knee starts to hurt, well, the signaling system in my body is saying, well, straighten your leg out. Yeah, and that's obvious. So I'm always a fan of saying respond to your body. Don't just sit in lotus for 10 minutes because someone says sitting in lotus for 10 minutes is a kind of higher state of being. To me, it's a stupid state of being. Ignoring your body that has a richly endowed nervous system, to ignore that thing that's kept us going for 600 million years, it seems to me the height of stupidity. If But the nuanced argument, or rather the more subtle argument that he brings to it, he says psychological discomfort is exactly the same. Feelings of anger or fear or any other kind of emotional state are social homeostatic mechanisms. So if I want to get on with my fellow people, and I don't know, someone nicks my food and I feel a response of anger, that's a kind of justifiable way of making sure that food is distributed evenly between the group, if you like. You know, there's some very basic things there. But also, you know, if I have an argument with my wife or my son or a friend, and I walk away with it, it's a kind of knot in the stomach that I feel. It's not up in my head, it's not a thought, it's a feeling. I go away feeling, and it's the reason we have discomforting feelings, and this is the point here, and I'm very interested in this, is to stop us in our tracks and make us change our behavior. Or at least reflect on our behavior and see if our behavior needs to change. Now that might be straightening a knee out because we've been sitting there too long, or it might mean I need to apologize because I've said a cross word and, you know, it's bugging me. Or it might be that I've crossed words and when I've reflected on it, because I've got that funny feeling, I've thought, no, I was all right there, it was them. Because that's possible too. But the point is to reflect. Because if you ignore those feelings and you carry on, you usually wind up deeper in the mire. It doesn't get better by ignoring things. Your knee won't get better if you ignore it. Your relationships won't improve if you ignore them. And even philosophically, I think we have discomforting feelings. And the most obvious one recently was the Brexit debate. Whichever side of that you were on, and I'm not interested in which side you're on, I was really mindful of the fact that most people felt viscerally a response. It wasn't, I had to double check myself there, you see, because I thought I made a cognitive rational decision about why I wanted this, you know. But actually, when I really analysed it, it was just, I felt like I'd been ripped away from a family. You know, it was a gut feeling. It wasn't an intellectual feeling. And it made me stop and reflect on why I felt the way I did, to think about it a bit harder. And it's been a very useful tool. I find it a very useful tool now. When I get those kind of feelings, I've just had another one quite recently. It's all about something called cultural appropriation. I don't want to bore you with that one because it's a bloody minefield. But I feel discomforted about it because I don't think I've thought it through enough. I'm not quite sure. I think I know where I stand on it, but I'm discomforted enough that I realise I've got to really examine this. I've got to go through it, you know, argue it through in my head, talk to different people, and say, well, where do I really feel about this? You know, until I've come to some kind of satisfactory inner state that I can let go of it and go, yeah, okay, well, I think I understand now. So noticing discomfort leads us away from misery if we bother to pay attention and do it. So we could argue, and I think I'm making a reasonable connection here, that yoga, which philosophically has always been a soteriology, a way of ending suffering, I mean, that's its broad scope. I'm still interested in that. But the way I'm interested in it is through the body, which I think yoga has often been complicit in. You know, I think that's not an unreasonable claim to make for yoga generally. That by paying attention, which is another big theme in yoga, how do we pay attention to our feelings and reflect on them, that we can steer our lives in a way that reduce our suffering in the world and the suffering of other people, which is obviously seriously important. And if you take that any further, of course you realize that if you want to reduce suffering, you have to think about the environment, you have to think about oppression, you have to think about all kinds of things that cause other people to suffer. It becomes a bigger project. And that's where I am with it. Anyway, that's my story. And if you've got any questions, I'm happy to. Yeah.
I was quite interested because you talk about human function.
Yeah.
There's been a growth in the yin yoga movement.
Oh yeah.
And I was reading stuff about it, quite strong stuff recently. I wonder what your views on yin practice are. as it's now taught?
Yeah, yin yoga is it. What do I think of it? And yin yoga is, as far as I understand it, is a practice of staying in sustained positions for a long time with the intention of stretching fascia. Well, my first response is that's another bit of the body that I'm not very, I don't think you can take a bit of the body out, whether it's a muscle or a bit of fascia, and deal with it separately. It's just hopeless. I mean, about 10 years ago, I went to a conference, an osteopathic conference, and the first speaker was talking about muscles. The second speaker was talking about fascia. The person who talked about fascia never mentioned muscles. The person who talked about muscles never mentioned fascia. If you look at a body, you can't separate them. They're so intertwined. Fascia runs through muscles, it wraps around muscles, it's part of a muscle. To try and think of them as separate things is bonkers. Any more than trying to think of a joint as a separate thing, it's bonkers. So I'm not on side with the idea that you're trying to do something to a bit of the body. We could have another big debate about can you do anything to fascia, because that's a hot topic. It's amazing what topics get hot, actually. Can you stretch fascia or can't you? There's a lot of evidence that you can't stretch it. Quite a lot of evidence to support that. All you can do is make it creep for half an hour and then it will creep back again. So fascia exhibits a property called creep. So if I come into a yoga class, I start the class and I'm here, and then by the end of the class I'm here, my fascia has creeped that much, but I'll come back to the class the next day and I'll be back to there again. And I have to go through the class, I have to go through that process every time I go to a class. And the other thing is that I don't think there's anything to do with mapping movement in staying in one place, which is probably my bigger critique of it. So these days I'm more interested in whether does yoga help us map movement, and is it inclusive of all parts of us? And anything that's fragmenting us into bits in any kind of way, I see as less useful. Anything else? Yeah.
Well, I have something. Well, two things. One is a comment, which is the word that comes to mind running through this whole thing is awareness.
Yeah.
Covers
Yeah.
sort of.
Absolutely.
But I don't practice yoga, so I come from the outside. And in the light of you talking about, you didn't use the term, but I would call it natural movement.
Okay. Yeah.
Those movements.
Yeah. Normal human function.
Normal human function.
Yeah.
It seems to me, as an outsider, that yoga invests a lot of time in unnatural postures and movements.
I agree.
And when it does invest time in natural movements, it does so to an unnatural extent.
Yeah.
So we need to bend forward.
Yeah.
That's part of living.
Yeah.
We don't need to touch our head, to our face to our ankles.
No. Even more, we don't need to do. We spend very little time.
So
bipeds bend. Yeah.
Most of yoga practice.
Well,
or a lot of it.
It does. I call it yoga exotica. There's a lot of yoga exotica, and then you see, I think there are three strands of yoga that are around at the moment. There's what I call, authentic yoga. People who are attaching their yoga to a lineage, and it's very historical. It's a study of the texts, and they're trying to legitimize their yoga through their connection to history. And I think that's fine. I've got no problem with that. And then I think there's exercise yoga, where you're just stretching and strengthening, and you could be at Pilates, you could be at Bums and Tums, you could be at anything you like. That is doing those kind of things. It's not very different. And then there's performance yoga, where you're doing exotic things like gymnastics or contortionism. But I'm not really sure that they're yoga then, because the self-reflective. I want to be careful here, because of course if you're doing a one-arm hand balance, on a top of a paint pot or something, you've got to pay a lot of attention. There's no doubt about that. But what we're not doing is paying attention. That's why I think this last point about discomfort becomes significant. It's not just about paying attention to movement. You've also got to know, when do you cross the line? Do I know when my life is becoming uncomfortable. Because, I don't know about you, but if I look around the world, lots of people are uncomfortable in their lives. And you think, well, how did that happen? You know, what point did you blunder into that uncomfortable world and just carry on? I'm pretty sure that at some point there was a little signal where you're going, whoa, I'm not sure if that's a good idea. And for whatever reason, you just took the next step. And I've done it many times, you know, and then ended up thinking, Christ, why did I do that? Why didn't I stop further back and take that other turning? And I think I ignored the signals because I had some other imperative driving me at the time. I know.
I do it all the time.
Yeah.
So my question is really in terms of having a yoga which supports a modern lifestyle.
Yeah.
How much do we aim it at this increasingly restrictive?
Okay. Yeah, I gotcha. So what you're saying is that the modern urban lifestyle has a very small repertoire of movements. Should we just be supporting those movements, or should we broaden it out? Well, there's lots of kind of interesting peripheral research around this, that if your repertoire of movements, and therefore your maps of your body movements, become smaller, 2 or 3 things seem to happen. One is that we lose certain movements quite early on. And the most common one is just being able to get to the floor. You know, if you never... I'm always nicely surprised by yoga in that you can walk into a class of people in their 60s, 70s and 80s and they'll all be sitting on the floor. Where else do you see men and women in their 60s, 70s and 80s sitting on the floor and not worrying about it? It's just comfortable. You know, yoga classes and those kind of movement classes facilitate that. If you don't do that, there's a lot of evidence to say that hip and knee arthritis get worse. Arthritis, unless you're a kind of professional footballer or something, arthritis, degenerative arthritis that gets really bad is much more an underuse problem than an overuse problem. So I'm always encouraging my students. I say, look, if in your yoga class you learn how to sit on the floor, then when you get home, sit on the floor. Don't, you know, if you're going to watch the telly, sit on the floor, lean against your sofa, don't sit on your sofa. I do try and persuade people to do that. And also, I'm not trying to make yoga a substitute for their active life. I want to persuade people to be active. So, you know, I'll tell people to get off the bus a couple of stops earlier and walk a bit, or take the stairs and not the lift, and, you know, those very common sense things, because being a sedentary human being is definitely bad for us. And what yoga can do is make sure that we have a body that can keep people functioning right until they die, which is what I would like to be myself. You know, I'd like to die healthy. Is that okay? Good. I think there are. These are very big themes, and I'm aware this is going to be filmed, and people are going to be watching this. Like, I'm going to get pilloried if I get this wrong, because it's a really heated topic. I think, you know, one of the things about cultural appropriation is respect. Do you respect the tradition from which it comes? Do you acknowledge it? You know, that's part of it. I agree that certainly the big franchises in America that are just monetizing yoga, and you know, you can buy a Lululemon top for 500 quid. It's just bonkers, isn't it? I mean, that's got nothing to do with yoga as far as I'm concerned. That's just the capitalist machine, you know, grinding yoga like it grinds everything else into the dirt, which is part of the cultural appropriation critique of yoga and a critique of anything else. So we monetize something for our own gain that started off as something much more serious. So I'm on side with that, you know, I'm completely on side with that. And then there is this other thing about, I mean, one of the other things that happened at about the same time as yoga coming to the West was rock and roll. Now, you know, Elvis Presley was appropriating Delta blues. No doubt about it. Rock and roll got built up on that whole kind of blues-based origins. And they were an oppressed people, you know, the black slavers who developed the blues. You know, and the corporate machine has ground that down. It's made a huge amount of money out of rock and roll. what do we do about that? I mean, how can we untangle all this stuff? I find it a very difficult thing. When do you say... You see, I grew up in the kind of 60s, and the person who got me into yoga was Mahatma Gandhi. And he said, it doesn't matter whether you're a Christian, a Hindu, or Muslim, you've got to see past all that as a human being. We've all got our cultures, but at the bottom line is we're all human beings. Martin Luther King, same thing. You know, I had a dream speech, and it shivers down my spine, still does. Black and white people are walking together. You try and see past it. Krishnamurti, he said, even calling yourself an Englishman is an act of violence because you're separating yourself from somebody else. I'm kind of on board with that. And now we've got cultural appropriation. It's pushing us into our little corners, you know, saying actually you can't braid your hair like a black person if you're a white person because you didn't suffer like they did. You can't play blues music because you didn't suffer like they did. Now, I kind of understand that I don't get the suffering, you know, because I'm not an oppressed person, so I don't get the suffering. But, you know, now I can't like Bob Dylan because, you know, when he wrote Hurricane about a black guy suffering in prison, he didn't suffer. He wasn't that black person suffering. How can a white person make money out of singing a song about a black person suffering? I don't know where I am with all this. I find it a very confusing debate. I always thought, and I always grew up with the notion that cultures fused into each other, and in the fusion of cultures, something richer came out of it. That was my understanding of, you know, why I like pizza or, you know, I drink tea and coffee. They're not, you know, it's a very hard one. But I'm also very aware of this, and I'm 63, and the people who are mainly talking about cultural appropriation are under 30. You know, I'm of a generation that did grow up with those kind of what I would call Enlightenment perspectives. I grew up thinking the Enlightenment project to grab us out of superstitious thinking was a good project to how do we help human beings flourish in the world. That seemed like a good project. And the whole point of that project was to see past difference. Now there is a kind of post-colonial idea that anyone who has been oppressed has a right to take back what was theirs and not let other people exploit it. That's a very different perspective. And I'm not sure. You see, my worry is I'm not sure where it goes. I'm not sure where it ends up. It seems everything has to trace itself back to its source now, and then only white people will do white people things, only black people do black people things, any yellow people will be able to do yellow people things, or any Muslims can do Muslim things, any Christians can do, and there will be a separating out of all these things. I'm not quite sure if that's healthy. In fact, I'm pretty sure I think it isn't healthy. Well, thank you. I think I've said all I should say, and if I go any deeper into that, it's going to be a new job I'm going to get massacred.
Thanks, Pete.
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, pleasure. Oh, thank you.